The story of Commodore Perry. The United States did not formally recognize Liberia until after the Civil War, but it continued to exert influence and care through international agreements as much as possible. Despite this, the U.S. had to maintain a naval force on the West African coast to suppress the slave trade, which persisted illegally well into the 1880s. In fact, the last known slave ship arrived in the U.S. in 1864. During the Commonwealth period, the transatlantic slave trade was still a pressing issue, with kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo continuing to sell human beings into bondage. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Liberia's first president, became a key figure in aggressively combating this trade, working alongside the U.S. and British navies to advance the cause of abolition. The U.S. Navy, with a squadron led by Commodore Matthew C. Perry, was primarily deployed to violently suppress the slave trade, not to engage in peaceful negotiations with indigenous African powers. Perry, known for his harsh methods, commanded several ships on this mission, which underscored the violent nature of the efforts to eradicate the transatlantic slave trade. The Ashburton Treaty between the U.S. and Britain even obligated the U.S. to maintain a naval force of 80 guns on the West African coast for this purpose. The U.S. Navy and European forces were deployed to enforce Western laws on the West African coast, particularly those aimed at suppressing the slave trade. From the perspective of the indigenous people and those profiting from the slave trade, these laws were an imposition. While most would agree that the slave trade was immoral, for those who enriched themselves by selling their enemies into slavery, the idea of foreign forces dictating their practices was seen as intrusive. Despite laws against the slave trade, European and American slavers continued to smuggle people into the U.S., where chattel slavery was still active in the southern states. The demand for enslaved labor persisted, and the enforcement of anti-slavery laws conflicted with that economic reality. To address this, the U.S. and British forces sent violent enforcers, not negotiators, to suppress the trade. These warriors, like Commodore Matthew Perry, were tasked with dispensing justice through violence. However, this liberation came at the cost of violently subduing the local leaders and imposing treaties only after their defeat. This method, violence first, treaties second, defined Roberts's interactions with indigenous people. His goal was to stop the entrenched practice of trading human beings, but his means were brutal. For example, Commodore Perry was ordered to support the colony in any way possible, including showing force along the Liberian coast to bring the locals into compliance. Perry's mission was to assist Roberts, and they traveled together on various military campaigns to enforce these Western laws. Perry's orders also included addressing any violence committed by natives against American vessels or people. This perceived threat was often used as a pretext for violent reprisals. Coastal communities were forced into submission through displays of military power, with the ultimate goal of stopping the slave trade. The people along the Grain Coast, including the Gola, Bassa, and Kla, have a long history of looting ships that ran into trouble near their shores. When ships were sinking or attacked by pirates, locals would often take advantage, looting goods like rum, gunpowder, and cannons. Occasionally, they would even release human beings trapped in the holds of these ships, likely captives meant for the slave trade. However, accusations that these indigenous people were attacking American vessels or their crews seem unfounded. Many times, a ship would wreck near a coastal community, and it was simply assumed that the locals had attacked and killed the crew. But historically, it was more likely that the locals looted a wreck, not that they had the capability or desire to launch full attacks on vessels equipped with cannons. Furthermore, the notion of these indigenous people using canoes to capture ships seems far-fetched. The more plausible scenario involved the retrieval of captives from barracoons, coastal holding areas where captives awaited transportation by slave ships. Battles usually occurred when people attempted to rescue captives from these barracoons, not when they pursued ships on the open water. The idea that these communities would attack American vessels for no reason does not align with the historical realities of the time. Governor Roberts, later President Roberts of Liberia, was brought on board Commodore Perry's flagship in 1846 to assist in missions along the coast. Their primary objective was to dismantle barracoons and release captives who were held there for sale into slavery. However, when these captives were freed, they were not returned to their original communities, as many had been taken from distant regions. Instead, they were incorporated into the Liberian settlement, where they were often Christianized and became part of the Commonwealth. Roberts believed this violent approach was necessary to liberate those on the brink of enslavement, but the method came at a high cost. The slave trade was fiercely protected by heavily armed guards, and to destroy a barracoon meant engaging in deadly combat. Those guarding the captives would fight to the death, as their livelihood and honor were at stake. The cultural expectation at the time was to fight without surrender unless ordered to do so by the king, making these battles especially brutal. Despite the violence, Roberts continued to assist in missions beyond the boundaries of Liberia, including operations in Maryland in Africa, present-day Ivory Coast. Commodore Perry claimed that Roberts participated willingly to dispense justice for U.S. citizens, but these missions often reflected a mindset in which African people engaged in the slave trade were seen as having no rights. The European mentality, prevalent in both Europe and its colonies, was that black people, whether native to Africa or living among Europeans, had no rights that white men were bound to respect. This belief fueled the justification for violence and harsh actions against those involved in the trade, further dehumanizing African people in the eyes of their oppressors. The mission was to pull in and attack the barracoons, releasing the captives. However, it's important to note that when these captives were released, they weren't returned to their original communities. Many of them had been war captives taken from faraway places. Instead, they were incorporated into the settlement, not sent back to where they came from. This part is important because, while the captives were liberated, they became part of the Commonwealth of Liberia, and later on they became the first citizens of the Republic. But this liberation came at a cost. The slave trade was a violent enterprise. The kings and those involved in the trade had heavily armed guards to protect their human cargo. Without military protection, buyers could easily overpower them and steal both the captives and the profits. Destroying a barracoon required fighting a military force, and these battles were to the death. Those involved in the trade were defending their livelihood, and within the cultural context of the time, people were bound to fight under the orders of their kings. If the king demanded they fight, surrender was not an option. They fought until death. Governor Roberts eventually agreed to accompany a squadron beyond the boundaries of Liberia to Maryland in Africa, helping to influence native kings to deliver justice and reparation to U.S. citizens. Commodore Perry claimed that Roberts went on his own accord to dispense justice. The specific area they went to is now part of the Ivory Coast, but at the time, it was the colony of Maryland in Africa, which stretched into what is now Côte d'Ivoire. One particular battle was deeply disturbing, and it highlighted the mentality of the time. Those engaged in the slave trade were seen as less than human, and in this worldview, they had no rights, no right to a trial or any form of justice. It was a brutal world, with human chattel constantly being shipped from the coast. The mindset of European men, including those in the United States, was that African people, or Negroes as they were called, had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. This was the tragic reality that shaped the violent conflicts over the slave trade. During this period, there were no requirements for a fair trial or proof of guilt before violently retaliating. Since African people's rights were not recognized, violent actions against them were justified without due process. This was the mindset that framed the interactions between European and American powers and the indigenous peoples. Now, moving to the next incident, this is Commodore Perry speaking. The king sent word that if anyone from his tribe was wanted, they would have to come and take them. The next morning, about 500 Marines and sailors landed. Still not wanting to burn the towns, they pitched a tent on the beach and sent messengers to summon the king and his headmen to hold a palaver, as they termed it. Within about an hour, the king appeared with some 10 or more sub-chiefs. The context behind this was that a ship had wrecked offshore, and Commodore Perry accused the chief of harboring those responsible for pirating the ship. Perry demanded that the chief produce the individuals responsible, promising not to fight or destroy the villages if the culprits were handed over. However, the chief insisted that no one had pirated the ship, explaining that it had simply washed ashore after the crew had already perished. He claimed that any looting had occurred after the wreck, not before. Based on the king's response, it seems likely that someone had indeed pirated the ship at sea, a common occurrence during this violent period, and that the wreck had simply drifted to shore. The ship in question was an American slave ship, which Perry was attempting to portray as a legitimate vessel involved in trade. Despite the king's insistence that his people were not involved, Perry continued to press him to produce the guilty parties. According to Perry, the king eventually told him that if he wanted anyone, he would have to come and take them by force. While it's possible the king said this, it doesn't add up with his earlier assertions of innocence. On one hand, the king was claiming that neither he nor his people had anything to do with the incident. On the other hand, Perry claimed the king challenged him to come and take whoever he wanted. This contradiction cast doubt on Perry's account. It seems more likely that Perry, trained for combat rather than negotiation, was set on attacking the people regardless of the king's denial of guilt. The king had set up the palaver, bringing the council of elders and other leaders in an attempt to negotiate and assert their innocence. However, Commodore Perry was determined to fight, not to engage in peaceful resolution. At this time, Roberts was still the governor of Liberia, not yet its president. This event is significant because it set the tone for how Roberts would handle similar situations during his presidency, as all of the acquisitions and actions during his first term followed a similar pattern. On the 5th of October, they went ashore, captured the king, and after the palaver, things started to fall apart. The king realized that negotiations were breaking down. When the king would speak and the translator would translate, Commodore Perry would respond. First of all, Commodore Perry shouldn't have been negotiating with the king. This shows a clear lack of respect from the naval force toward these people. A commodore should not be negotiating with a king in any sense. Perry could not go to Europe and negotiate with Queen Victoria at the time, so it was offensive that he was treating a king on his sovereign land as if it were a military acquisition. During the palaver, when the king was still professing his innocence, Joseph Jenkins Roberts was present. At no point did Roberts suggest bringing in representatives from Maryland, which was separate from Liberia at the time. Not once did they call in anyone from the Maryland settlement to help. They failed to recognize that they were in Maryland's territory and that these kings were sovereign within Maryland's protection. At no time did Roberts acknowledge this or admit that they were outside of Liberian jurisdiction. Instead, Roberts stood there with Commodore Perry, witnessing the execution of a sovereign monarch on his own soil. They shot the king, killing many of his soldiers who were protecting him. Many headmen and chiefs who tried to flee were killed on the spot. Commodore Perry didn't even consider the possibility of sparing them. When he wrote about it, he boasted, "Roberts was present for all of this. The king, who was the head of the headmen, was almost mortally wounded. At one point, they thought he was dead. They took him on board their ship, claiming they wanted to render aid, but the king later died on the vessel. They wrapped him up and threw his corpse overboard." Commodore Perry wrote about this without even having the decency to give the monarch a proper burial. For me, this was a very difficult account to read. I've been familiar with it for quite some time, but revisiting it now highlights the kind of incidents that marked Roberts's early career as a political leader of Liberia, first as the head of the Commonwealth. This event occurred just 1 year before he became president. I felt compelled to include this story because Roberts was present, and it never occurred to him to object to what was happening. Nor did it occur to him to seek the counsel of the people of Maryland, to ask, "Do you believe this king is innocent?" Negotiations could have occurred, but they didn't. The Marylanders would have probably said, "No, this man is not a violent king," just like all the other headmen who came to council had been saying, but it didn't matter. Someone had to pay. They had to send a message to everyone on the coast that interfering with a U.S. flag vessel would not be tolerated. It's more likely that a European pirate ship had interfered.